Good afternoon. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our leadership team, former Congressman Mel Levine and former Los Angeles County Supervisor Zeb Yaroslavsky. Tonight, we mark the 6th anniversary of America at a Crossroads. We began this series in March 2020 in the earliest days of the COVID quarantine, when most of us were still learning how to use Zoom or maybe even not even knowing what it was. We were imagining that the disruption of our lives would be brief. We soon realized that would not happen. We assumed that we would soon return to our Los Angeles-based in-person monthly programs, which had begun in 2017. 6 years and hundreds of programs later, this series continues because the moment continues. The pressures on democratic institutions have not subsided. And so we persist, not out of habit, but out of conviction. We continue because we believe deeply in the necessity of an informed civic dialogue. And because of you, this extraordinary audience, you share that belief with us. Before we go further, Mel, Zev, and I would like to pause to remember the beautiful life of David Lehrer, whose vision and moral clarity were foundational to the creation of this series. David helped shape not only what this program is, but what it has strived to be and become. We honor his legacy and we carry forward his purpose, and we miss him deeply. It is especially meaningful on this anniversary to welcome Jennifer Rubin, our very first guest 6 years ago, who has returned each year to help us take stock of where we are as a country and what lies ahead. So thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer's work combines intellectual rigor with an unwavering commitment to democratic principles, and we are deeply grateful for continued presence in this community. Pat will introduce Jennifer more fully in a moment. And speaking of Pat, we are very grateful to tonight's moderator, the incomparable Patt Morrison. Pat, now a columnist for the Los Angeles Times for the past many years, has had one of the most distinguished careers in American journalism across television, radio, and print. She is a recipient of 2 Pulitzer Prizes as part of team coverage, 6 Emmys, and more than a dozen Golden Mike Awards. She has also received both the Lifetime Achievement Award and a Distinguished Journalist Award from Los Angeles Press Club. Pat, we are fortunate beyond measure for your commitment to America at a Crossroads. Looking ahead, next week we will welcome Dahlia Dasa-Kay and Robin Wright, 2 of the nation's most respected analysts of Iran and the broader Middle East. They will provide a timely and deeply informed conversation on the evolving Iran crisis. Dahlia Dasa-Kay is a senior fellow at UCLA's Berkel Center for International Relations and the former director of the Rand Center for Middle East Public Policy. A leading scholar of U.S. Middle East policy, she writes extensively on regional security and diplomacy. She just published a book called Enduring Hostility, The Making of America's Iran Policy. And in the email you'll get after the program tonight, you'll see her most recent publication article in Foreign Affairs. So you might want to read that before next week's program. Robin Wright is an award-winning journalist, author, and foreign affairs analyst who has reported on the Middle East for decades. She has served as a correspondent for the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and NPR, and is the author of several books, including Sacred Rage, Dreams and Shadows, and Rock the Casbah. You'll definitely want to join us for that program. It'll be an amazing update and analysis of the situation in the Middle East. As always, we thank you, our audience, not only for joining us tonight, but for being part of this community committed to thoughtful engagement at these very consequential times. Now, please join me in welcoming Patt Morrison. Pat?
Janice, thank you so much. And thanks to all of you. Of course, the inspirational light of David Lehrer that helped to lead us here is one that will never go out. And we thank you as well for the light of your support that makes this keep going and makes it possible. Jennifer Rubin, who joins us, is, of course, the author of the book Resistance, How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. She worked for years at the Weekly Standard and wrote for the Washington Post. And then last year was co-founder now of the Substack called The Contrarian, which I hope you will all read and find it as enlightening as I do. Jen, thank you very much. I would light a birthday candle for the 6th anniversary for you joining us and closing the circle, but it's 95 degrees in LA and I'm not lighting a candle. We'll make it metaphorical.
I can imagine. You know, we were kidding around before coming on that had we known 6 years ago Donald Trump would still be in the White House. We'd be in another forever war in the Middle East. We'd be facing the stagflation, and democracy would be even more imperiled. We might not have continued. So sometimes it doesn't pay to know what's coming, and we just put one foot in front of another, and here we are.
Well, speaking of not knowing what's coming, let's talk about the Trump White House and the war in Iran, which seemed to be launched almost impulsively and to all appearances without regarding some of the guidelines and input and advice that experts on Iran, that experts in counterterrorism were offering up to Donald Trump. Most recently, we have Joe Kent, who had been the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, who resigned, citing his concerns about the strike, that he cannot in good conscience back the war, and said that Iran posed no imminent threat. A little later, we'll be talking about the meaning of words, which you've written about in the Trump administration, the meaning of imminent. But here we have almost a capricious decision from the White House, at least from what it looks like from the outside, and one that has now roiled much of the world, endangered oil supplies and stability in the Mideast, and exposed the relationship of Trump with allies that he insulted but counted on to come to his aid.
Let me just say a word about Joe Kent. He, of course, is an anti-Semite, a conspiratorialist, and in leaving, he blamed Israel, which, of course, is not responsible. Donald Trump is responsible for America. And frankly, Israel has tried to implore many US presidents to go into Iran, and only this one was dumb enough to do it. So I think he has to take complete responsibility. It is shocking that the full military might of the United States was launched so capriciously, as you correctly put it. First of all, entirely illegally. This is by any definition a war. Congress has the constitutional power, the sole constitutional power to declare war. They did not. This was not in response to any kind of imminent threat, so it also violates the UN Charter, which by Constitution is therefore incorporated in American law. So there you have two congressional or constitutional strikes. It is also entirely ill-conceived. And of course, they've had multiple rationales because they don't really know what they want to do. First, it was regime change. Then it was the nuclear program. Then it was the missile program. I just spoke with Alyssa Slotkin today, and she said what they've settled on with at least the congressional briefings, is the aim of disabling Iran from projecting power in the region. Well, if blocking the Strait of Hormuz counts, things are much worse than they were when we started. But it's that kind of disorganized thinking and malpractice that, of course, has characterized Donald Trump his entire life. And he's been extraordinarily lucky. He has picked adversaries like Venezuela, which were frankly pushovers. He has been restrained in his first term by somewhat informed advisors. But here, this is him unleashed in all of his irrational glory and all of his ignorance and all of his stupidity. And as you mentioned, it apparently did not dawn on him what every president has known, and that is Iran would retaliate by closing the Strait of Hormuz, sending oil prices sky high, bombarding our allies, including Israel. And to not have understood this and understood that that was the reason why we don't go to war with Iran, if there is any other option available, really speaks volumes about Donald Trump's impulse control or lack thereof. I think we now are in a situation, as we are with all of these ill-fated adventures, and that is, how do we bring it to an end? And what does Congress do now that the administration is going to go up there and ask for, wait for it, the new number is $200 billion, as if they don't have enough already. Let's start with the how do we get out, or how do we bring this to an end? It's not our call entirely. Iran gets a vote. Israel gets a vote. So it is not, even if lightning were to strike, Donald Trump would suddenly understand what folly this is, and he would say, okay, declare victory, go home, that we could
Which
easily
is a
extract
phrase from the
ourselves.
Vietnam era, by the way. Declare victory and go home is a solution.
Absolutely. And you hear many Congress people now using that phrase. And as there, the difficulty is that if we pull out and they continue to pummel Israel and our other allies in the region, what do we do then? Do we leave with the Strait of Hormuz still blocked? What about Israel, which is continuing now to just decimate Beirut and its southern suburbs? So it's not entirely in our control. And that's the problem when you start these things. You do lose control of the timeline. As far as the money is concerned, Congress is continually put in this position. It happened during the Iraq War, if you recall, many times that lawmakers who were extremely opposed to the war, who knew this was folly, nevertheless kept voting for money because they didn't want to, quote, let the troops down. And this is the logical political fallacy involved, that they get bulldozed into voting for things that they shouldn't. We talked about the congressional power. Well, the power of the purse is the greatest power that they have. And they could end this by saying, not only aren't we giving you any more money, but none of the existing money can be used on offensive action. I don't think that they have the nerve to do that, frankly,
Well,
even Democrats.
as we have seen in domestic matters, Congress has had the power to say no again and again and again to enforce on the Trump administration, actually abiding by regulations, and it has chosen not to do so. Do you think this is
Correct.
an exception or no?
No, I don't. And the only question is whether they'll have to resort to a reconciliation process in order to get 50 plus one votes in the Senate, because they will not have 60, I suspect. Democrats should remain vigilant. The public expects that if you're opposed to a war, you don't turn around and fund it. Their base expects it, common sense demands it, and they should resist and force the officials to come up to the Hill and do what they have yet to do, which is really stunning. Tulsi Gabbard sort of did it today, which is testify in public. We still have not had a public hearing with Marco Rubio sitting there under oath, with Pete Hegseth sitting there under oath, and that's absolutely intolerable.
Well, let's talk about that, because the justification for the Iraq War was rooted in the 9/11 attacks, but as we know, the mantra was you don't want whatever the risk was to become a mushroom cloud, that Iraq was going to bomb everybody with nuclear weapons, and people went along with that. Now we have 6 months after Donald Trump declared that Iran's nuclear program had been disabled, we have a, quote, imminent threat that was supposedly coming from Iran against us. No definition, no time frame. Well, maybe 2 weeks, maybe not. And in a minute, I want to talk about what you've written about Trump's use of words as a transactional process. But what is the argument? And the American public seems not to be buying it, because, as you said, the justifications are shifting all of the time for losing these American lives in this attack,
Yes.
for losing at least $1 billion a day in this war when programs at home are going begging.
I will just say it, they're lying. There was no imminent attack by whatever definition you want to give to imminent. And you're right, they play fast and loose with that term. Iran has never been weaker in the last 47 years since the mullahs came to power. Their allies, their surrogates have been decimated in Hamas and in Lebanon. Their economy is in tatters. They suffered not only in other clashes with Israel and the United States, but most directly last year in the 12-day war. They're not in a position right now to rise up and create havoc for the United States. It is an oppressive regime. We should celebrate if and when it falls. But we have also seen that they have the guns. They are have really their country by the throat. The civilian population, which did rise up, was mowed down, was slaughtered, and we see no reason to believe anything else would happen. And now, oh, by the way, both the Israelis and the Americans acknowledge the regime is intact. That's not happening. So we were lied to, at least initially, and then they came up with a bunch of other reasons. So no, this is a war of choice, a poor choice, an awful choice. And I think, frankly, he did it because he thought he could get away with it. He was emboldened by the strikes in the Caribbean. He was emboldened by Venezuela. He's been emboldened by his lawlessness at home. And he just thought he could do it. And remember, he thinks of himself in grandiose terms. He's a historic figure. He's going to do what no president had ever done. And obviously, there are people in the White House and people in the Israeli government who feed that for their own motives to keep him going. And that's where he came out.
One more question about the war for now. And for our viewers, you can put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll get them sorted out as we talk to Jennifer a little later in the program and take your questions. And that has to do with Russia, with the big buddy relationship that Donald Trump supposedly had with Vladimir Putin. And now we find through very good reporting that Russia has been helping Iran with data about targeting U.S. sites and U.S. facilities, satellite imagery, improved drone technology. The thinking being, as long as the United States is distracted and focusing attention and money in on Iran, then it's not going to be able to face down Russia if Russia makes further moves in Ukraine, for example, or moves elsewhere in the world.
They have also made out like bandits because of the increase in oil prices, because they, of course, survive on their energy exporting. It is a big win for Vladimir Putin once again. And that is the single through line you can always count on in this presidency. And that is whatever he's doing just happens to benefit Vladimir Putin, whether it's abandoning Ukraine, whether it's creating havoc within NATO, whether it's lawlessness at home. It is all to the inures to the benefit of Russia. So it does not surprise me. It horrifies me, however, that this president, if he knows about it, doesn't care. If he doesn't know about it, is choosing not to know about it. And he persists in this, embrace of a man who is contributing to the deaths of American soldiers. You remember there was a scandal about this, that he was accused of doing the same thing in Afghanistan, that there had been reports that they had been giving bounties to kill Americans in Afghanistan. He also didn't care about that because he really has no loyalty to the United States. He's not trying to improve America's place in the world. He's trying to improve his own place in history and in the world, and his financial interests as well. So we have a situation in which he's not defending American interests. He is consorting with a power that is targeting and killing American interests. And he has pursued, of course, an energy policy that makes us all the more vulnerable when the fossil fuel train gets derailed.
We're going to talk a little later, too, about the corruption within the Trump administration, and not just in the White House itself, but through family relationships, through cabinet members, and the names being put on some of the schemes as the money seems to be going to one purpose, but in fact may be going to another. And I think you've written a lot about that. So we'll get to that. We'll get to the questions that you're putting in the Q&A box as well. The Senate right now is talking about the SAVE Act, which is supposedly to combat what is virtually non-existent voter fraud. So many of the cases that turn up tend to be Trump voters. There's a Georgia elected official who was convicted of a felony who voted illegally at least a half dozen times when he wasn't supposed to. But this is an act that will, in fact, and deliberately disenfranchise or seek to disenfranchise any number of Americans, including married women who take their husbands' names when they get married. It demands documents that are expensive, that are hard to get, in some cases impossible to get, like birth certificates for older Americans, passports, the kind of documents that have never been demanded in this country before within the country itself. So let us know what you think of where the SAVE Act is going, because there's a question that it may blow back on Republicans too. If you have more money, if you have a college education, you're likelier to have a passport. If you're a blue collar Trump worker, maybe not so much. So there's a lot going on with this act. And where do you think it's heading?
This is a function of an administration and a party that is bereft of ideas and bereft of accomplishments. They have failed at everything, at prices, at war, at immigration. And so their solution to the midterms is let's try to make sure as many people don't vote. And that's their scheme for holding on. Mike Lee, by the way, let the cat out of the bag when he admitted as such, saying, oh, we're in trouble. This will turn it around. Well, the only way it turns it around is, of course, if you get rid of voters who might turn out and vote against you. Fortunately, I firmly believe we can talk about that. They're not going to throw away the filibuster over this clunker. Now, the items that you listed, disenfranchising married women whose name doesn't match what their birth certificate says, requiring expensive documents, which amount to a poll tax. Those are illegal under the Constitution. Arguably, it's a violation of the 15th Amendment because minorities disproportionately don't have easy access. But it does not stop there. Rural voters are also disenfranchised, and those are generally Trump and red state voters. So it is a massive attack on the concept that the people hold the power and democracy has legitimacy because the greater population, the electorate, the legally qualified voters get to make decisions and hold people accountable. That's the central premise of our democracy. And they don't like it because they've failed. So they're up to this. In addition to making all of these hurdles for registration, they're making voting by mail virtually impossible. There was a base provision in there that said you had to, if you want to vote for mail, you have to include a Xerox of your ID, your photo ID. Probably half the country doesn't know what a Xerox is, and none of them have one in their house. And if you're voting by mail because you're too busy or because you have other difficulties, you're not going to vote because you have to go to a FedEx store or some other place to make a copy and send in your driver's license, which, by the way, is a recipe for identity theft.
Sure.
It makes no sense. But there's an amendment, and the amendment says, oh, no, we're going to just ban it entirely. That's how they think.
Ban mail-in voting.
Yeah, ban online, ban by mail voting, which has been used so successfully in multiple states. Republicans have discovered it. Republicans have used it. And this is all about this reflexive panic, this idea that it must be fraud. We're going to tell them it's fraud. It plays into their white nationalism that we're being swamped by illegal immigrants. It is an excuse mongering for why they lose elections rather than looking at themselves. And it is simply a distraction from their failures.
Well,
now, to get this through, they, of course, would have to break the filibuster, pass the House now early. It's in the Senate. And the question is, do Republicans, who have always claimed that the filibuster is essential, they cried crocodile tears when it was suggested that it be modified in order to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, for goodness sakes. Now they are suddenly thinking, well, maybe we should get rid of it after all. They're not going to do that. And the reason they're not going to do this is the smarter ones know this is grossly unconstitutional. It will go nowhere. They don't want it to pass because their own voters will be upset. This is show and tell for their base. And so they are content to let this die. The other reason is, and I have warned my Democratic friends, there'll be a piece on it tomorrow, so you get a little preview. Democrats have been thinking about getting rid of the filibuster for a long time because there's a long list of things Democrats would love to do if the filibuster were not in the way. Making statehood for DC and for Puerto Rico, universal voting by mail, codifying Roe and gay marriage, getting rid of ICE. You can go down the list of big ticket items that presumably would be very attainable if not for the filibuster. They know that on the Republican side. So this is not going to go anywhere. It doesn't mean it's not a threat. It doesn't mean it's not revealing of their mentality, but it is not going to pass.
So do you think they'll put on a show to debate it vigorously so Donald Trump will be satisfied if he turns on the television and sees the floor discussion and yet
Yes.
vote against it? Or are they counting on
And
the Democrats to kill this?
the Democrats will kill this, and Donald Trump will not be satisfied because he's never satisfied, but he will have his excuse because he will say, if they had passed the SAVE Act, we would have been reelected. Those stupid Republicans can never get anything right. And that will be his excuse, in addition to whatever fraud he incorrectly claims is going to be going on in November. So it's an all-purpose excuse generator for the Republicans.
So this is not even going to get to the Supreme Court, but what has gotten to the Supreme Court are some of the redistricting and the gerrymandering issues in different states, including California's. Where do you think the numbers settle out in that effort to gerrymander themselves into a better position for the Democrats or the Republicans? Where I haven't been keeping score.
I'm going to put for a moment Calais to the side. Calais is the case out of Louisiana, which would really eviscerate the Voting Rights Act and Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, allowing massive redistricting to eliminate most of the Black and Hispanic representatives, particularly in the South. So let's put that to the side for a moment and just talk about the redistricting wars. I think at worst, for Democrats, it would be a draw because in response to Texas, which by the way, may not work out for Republicans since they are losing the Hispanic vote and now risk putting some of their incumbents in a hot spot because in order to make these new districts, they have to take some voters away from incumbents. And so those people may wind up losing seats. So they may not have those in the bag. California has successfully, at least for now, defeated an effort to get to the Supreme Court on Prop 50. That presumably is going to go through, although I leave that to the California voters. Other states have also gotten into the act. Virginia, for example, is in the process of a redistricting. So I think when the dust settles, at worst, it will be a draw, and that's a victory for Democrats too, because it will have enlivened them, it will have woken them up. It generated huge interest in Texas, and frankly, I don't think they would have nominated James Tallarico, who made quite a name for himself during that battle, had it not been for this fight. So if it woke up and engaged voters in some of these states, that's also a win, even if the numbers don't increase.
You pointed out Tallarico, who defeated Jasmine Crockett, and in the primaries, the Democratic primaries in Illinois, you had moderate candidates do better than an admittedly split field of more progressive candidates. So where do you see Democrats strategizing toward the midterms? Does it depend on the state, even the district, the more moderate candidate or the more progressive candidate doing better?
I think they are looking for fighters. And sometimes that is the progressive because they realize there's no halfway between the fascists and the progressives. You just have to fight. And sometimes, frankly, it's someone who isn't so progressive on the merits, but has a fighting spirit and a determination. That's what we saw in the election of two women in governor's races last year in New Jersey and Virginia. So it is not ideology. It's very interesting. Elliot Morris, G. Elliot Morris, who is an independent pollster and analyst who's doing some work for us now, looked at this issue. And it is not that Democratic voters think Democratic electeds are too progressive or too conservative. It's that they think they're too weak. And that's the message that they have sent, to go in there and fight. And I think the specifics of what they want to fight to, sure, they want a solid Democratic agenda, but I would caution that it's not necessarily a matter of ideology. And I think we're going to find, as it was in Illinois, a little bit all over the map. And we would, of course, be remiss if we didn't talk about the role of dark money. And that's APAC money, that's AI money, that's crypto money, which has greatly polluted our system. And $22 million was spent in dark money on 4 congressional races in Chicago in the primaries. That's crazy. And that's a distortion and a corruption of our political system.
But speaking of being forceful, we have Democrats in the House now who seem to be a little more assertive because the Trump administration, fearful again of the midterms, people are looking at long lines at TSA. They're making a deal about DHS. They're making deals that they would not have done even 6 months ago or considered. What's the state of those, and what's the larger context? Where's the needle going on that?
The administration is running scared. That's why they dumped Kristi Noem. They put up Mullen, who had a disastrous hearing. He will get through, but he is clearly a buffoon, but he's talking more mildly. So you get headlines in the New York Times, a softer tone. Well, that's nice, a softer tone. He is still engaging in the same noxious policies of mass deportation. So they think they can change the politics without changing the policy. They sent a letter very belatedly back to the House responding to the demands on reform. And essentially what they said is, maybe we'll follow the law as it is, maybe, but nothing else. And don't ask us for anything else. It was really shocking. Okay, we'll abide by the law not to deport American citizens.
And that's the deal.
That's a concession. That's a deal. They are going through the motions because they're trapped. If they move in any significant degree, their base kills them. If they don't move, then they are at loggerheads with a growing dissatisfaction about their immigration policy and their tactics. So they're caught. They're doing what they always do, which is try to lie and pantomime their way out of it. So far, Democrats are not buying it. They're saying, forget it. They just put another vote on the floor today, actually, to fund TSA, the Coast Guard, and FEMA, which are bearing the brunt because they're within DHS, and so that they can isolate and worry just about the DHS. Republicans oppose that because they don't want those things to be lost as leverage. They like it when our air travel is screwed up. They like it when people are frustrated in getting FEMA on the phone because that's their leverage. They think Democrats will be blamed, and therefore they think they can hold out, and eventually Democrats will blink. I think at this point, Democrats have seen this game. They will go on for a bit longer. Right now, I don't think the needle has moved much at all, which is the public does not like ICE, does not like this policy. They also won't like having their travel disrupted, but I think even the polls show that they would rather have some reforms and the government not open than the reverse.
Well, you see, even among the Trump base, Florida sheriffs, for example, saying,
yes,
no, this kind of ICE deportation is not working. The Trump administration itself is talking up some kind of guest worker program because so many of the industrial and agricultural sectors and the construction sectors have been gutted of workers and are paralyzed.
Exactly.
So people are realizing the consequences of their votes across virtually every sector of the country.
That's exactly right. And so his natural allies in the business, in big ag, do not like this. And oh, by the way, if you look at the economic numbers, we are stalled on jobs. We are losing population. At the same time, inflation is going up. We are headed to, put on your bell bottoms, folks. Stagflation is back.
Oh, no, not bell bottoms.
Not bell bottoms, but stagflation will be back, and part of that is we're screwing up our own labor market, and consumers. If you deport 1 million people, you have 1 million less consumers, 1 million less workers, 1 million less jobs. So this is malpractice of the worst kind, and it is coming home to roost. And I think at this point, Republicans are kind of dead men and women walking. They see the guillotine ahead of them. And that's why so many of them are retiring. Record numbers are retiring. They want out. And who could blame them?
Putting the tumbrils in reverse, that would be a sight to behold. Let me
Yes.
ask you before we go to our audience questions about corruption and the profit machine that Donald Trump has turned the White House into. The TikTok deal and a $10 billion payment that who knows where that money is going. The fact that the foundation for the Trump library has been dissolved, but there's tens of millions of dollars from people like Elon Musk that went into that. Where is that money going? Jared Kushner picking up $2 billion from Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund. At the same time, he's supposed to be in the Mideast negotiating peace, negotiating terms. It's so blatant, I suppose, that maybe that's why they're getting away with it, and it's theft in plain sight.
And that is exactly right. And don't forget the ballroom. Don't forget the crypto buying, which is being bought up again by Middle East interests. Don't forget the pardons for sale industry that is going on. It goes on and on and on. And it is the most massive, disgusting corruption on a scale we have never seen in this country. This is Russia. This is how third world potentates operate, and that is they rob the till. This is a smash and grab operation. He is there to get rich and get his family rich, and he will write himself a check if he has to, claiming damages from his prosecutions, and have his Justice Department write him another check for 10 or 20 billion dollars. It is vile. And the Republicans, of course, are accessories to this because they won't stop him. They don't care. They don't want to see it. This is perhaps the best reason of many reasons, to get real oversight. So we will at least know what has been taken, where the money has gone. And there are a lot of smart people working on both civil and potentially criminal avenues down the road to get this money back. Donald Trump may be immune, but the people giving him money are not immune. And that's going to be an interesting legal battle down the road.
This is like the Teapot Dome scandal, when the man, Albert Fall, the Interior Secretary, who got the money was convicted, but the man who gave him the money was not convicted. So there are all these
Exactly.
little loopholes that are available. Let's go to some questions. And one of them that's on everybody's mind, let me see if I can find it again here, is goodness, let's see. Here we go. Many people want to know about the relationship with Trump. Jim, relationship with Trump and Russia, about the intelligence to target our forces. Why is this not treasonable? Why are people in Congress and in the general public sphere not outraged about this?
They should be outraged. And this is the same problem we have with everything, every outrage he does, and that is that the Republicans don't care and they won't pursue it. It is an outrage. Russia is targeting our troops. Donald Trump continues to play footsie with Putin for reasons that continue to create controversy, whether it's financial, whether it's personal, whether it's aspirational. But it is absolutely abominable. It is completely unacceptable. And this, because we're not in a war with Russia, technically, although they're helping, it's technically is not treason, but it is treasonous. It is a betrayal of American interests. But then everything Donald Trump does is a betrayal of American interest. Trying to overthrow an election is a betrayal of American interest. By the way, we forgot one of the other escapades, which is he's putting the money from Venezuelan oil in an overseas account. We're told it's going to make its way back to the Treasury.
But that's the only assurance we have. is Donald
Yes,
Trump's word.
yes,
Well, take that for what it's worth. And many people
exactly.
want to know that the chances are that Trump will declare a state of emergency, and perhaps even using this war that he's created as a condition and suspend the midterms. And you and I were talking before we went on that there were elections during the Civil War. There were elections during World War II. Why would anybody think that this would supersede those very dire circumstances to allow him to do that?
Exactly. There is a myth afoot that there's some provision that if he calls an emergency, elections get called off. It does not work that way. There is no emergency and therefore you end elections. Whatever emergencies he wants to declare or make up may justify or not, as we found out, deployment of National Guard or deployment of the military. They do not equate to, and then the election gets canceled. Those two things do not intersect. So this notion that he could create an emergency and then cancel elections is wrong. What we should be concerned about are really two things. One is deployment of DHS, National Guard, regular military in ways that suppress voting, deter voting. And Democrats are going to have to do a lot of litigating. They're going to have to do a lot of preparation to vote by mail. By the way, this is why they want to end vote by mail, because it's an end around overt voter suppression and repression. The other thing they're going to do, and we've seen test runs of this in both Arizona and in Georgia, is they're going to pressure or even try to seize ballots. They're going to claim fraud. They're going to seek to stop the counting. Remember that one from 2020?
And since
And
2000 as well.
and once again, Democrats are going to have to be on their toes. They're going to have to be in court. And one of the benefits, frankly, of this maneuver in Fulton County is it woke up the Democratic legal teams, and they are now very well prepared. And there are game plans in every state to combat this if and when it occurs. I would argue this, however, if the out if the turnout is overwhelming and the results are overwhelming, they can't cheat enough. And that's why it's so important to have a massive outpouring of voter participation. It is very, very hard to steal an election on a national scale. We found out about that in 2020, in part because the system is completely decentralized. They may try to nationalize it. Remember Donald Trump saying, I want to nationalize elections? That's why. But it does not work that way. So I think we should be on guard. I think we should be concerned. I think we need to litigate as much in advance as possible. But I do feel confident that elections will be held, and that if there is any semblance of fair and free elections, that there will be massive losses for the Republicans.
Well, and quickly, so we can get to the next question. It sounds like you're saying there are layers of protection, whether it's local election boards, whether it's states, whether it's even courts, both state courts and federal courts, that can have a say over this if Trump pushes that button.
I agree. They can create chaos. They can create doubts about the outcome, which is their other gambit, to create a crisis of legitimacy. But in terms of stopping the vote, actually changing enough votes, I think they're out of luck.
Here's a question from Norman. He said the AIPAC influence, the Israeli catalyst to the war, coupled with the Epstein scandal, this all includes a number of Jewish participants that he says has put American Jews in a dangerously critical situation. How do you deal with this perception? How do you reverse it?
This is a excellent question and a very serious problem. As we all know, AIPAC in the old days did not participate in elections. It was a bipartisan group. It was to support aid and a strong bipartisan relationship with Israel. But that has changed. They have entered the political arena, and they have some very wealthy, they're billionaires, frankly, who are very right wing. And their mission is to muck around in Democratic primaries. They would rather defeat someone like Tom Malinowski and have someone who is much more critical of Israel than have someone who is experienced, who has nuance, who would argue intelligently for some redefinition and realignment of America-Israel policy. So they are on fire right now. They are dumped into the ninth and the eighth, the second and the seventh in the Chicago area, $7 million. That is an inordinate amount of aid. And I'll give you a perfect example. The ninth congressional district. Daniel Biss is a grandchild of Holocaust survivors. He has lived in Israel. He is devoted to the Jewish people. What he would not do, however, is support a policy that said we will unconditionally support Israel on aid. In other words, no matter what they do, we're obligated to give them money. That he would not do. And as a result, they dumped millions on his head. They were tricky, however, because they've realized that AIPAC has kind of a bad name. So they set up new groups. Women Fight for Chicago and other things that sound very innocuous. And they would support.
They always sound innocuous.
They always do. They're very clever. And so they would, they didn't go after the candidate who was most aggressive towards Israel, who had accused Israel of genocide, because frankly, they'd rather have someone to point to and say, see how terrible those people are, than to have someone like a Daniel Biss, who is an intelligent proponent of a progressive position on Israel. So they came in there with millions. They disguised who they were. They wouldn't identify Israel as the issue they were opposing best, because that is not popular. Instead, they made up a bunch of other scurrilous charges. Well, they lost, and they lost big. And that, I think, is created some consternation within AIPAC. Is this really what we want to be doing? Is this productive? Is this the right way to do it? Do we really want to make Israel a strictly partisan issue? For years, decades, Pat, the mantra was Israel has to be bipartisan. Remember that? No more, according to AIPAC. So it's put them in a bind. And Biss did three things that are essential for all Democrats. First of all, you identify who it is. You called out the groups, identify where the money was. And it wasn't just AIPAC. It was crypto money and it was AI money, which is huge in these races. Secondly, you hold your position. If you have taken a position on principle, you stick with it and you double down. And third, you make this an issue of character, that you don't want politicians who are going to be bullied and pushed around by special interests. You want people who are going to have the wherewithal to say no. And that formula, at least in the ninth, worked. Whether it will work elsewhere, we'll find out as the primary season goes on.
Jim has a related question about Joe Kent, about his anti-Semitic rant.
Yes.
To what extent the Trump administration is already trying to discredit him. People who oppose the war are saying, see, he's right, but only about this, trying to isolate him from all his other unpleasant viewpoints. So where does that end up?
Part of the problem is the administration itself, in the person of Marco Rubio, said something very similar. He said that, well, Israel said they were going to go, so we had to go too. That was a lie, frankly. Israel can do whatever they want. It's up to the American president to decide what he wants to do. So they've helped fuel this fire. And as everyone knows, whenever Israel is involved, the anti-Semitic tropes build up that we are only involved not because of American interests, but because of Jewish money or because of a Jewish cabal or the Jewish media. So it elevates even further. You add to the mix this guy who is a far-right conspiratorialist who would rather blame Bibi Netanyahu than his cult leader, Donald Trump, and you come out with this very anti-Semitic, twisted explanation of why we went to war. It nevertheless is creating havoc on the Republican side because they have a a schism. It may not be apparent yet, but they clearly have a group of people who voted for Donald Trump thinking he was going to keep them out of forever wars. And he hasn't. He's launched another one. So this aggravates that. We should denounce Joe Kent as a figure, as a conspiratorialist. But we should also be clear that there was no imminent threat. This is a war of choice, and there are plenty of credible people who are making that argument.
Phil wants to know about the prospect of Trump ending the war in in Iran and declaring victory, and where that would position Netanyahu and Israel vis-a-vis their position in the Mideast, not only apropos of Iran, but how does it reconfigure anything after a war that may not have achieved what Donald Trump said or didn't say that he wanted it to achieve?
Well, Bibi has a similar, but not identical problem to Donald Trump, which is he has said things that are unattainable. He's also talked about regime change, which is also not happening. However, he has a different set of interests, and that is for Israel, Iran really is an existential threat. And every time Hamas attacks, every time Hezbollah attacks, when they see the nuclear program going, they realize it is aimed at them. So they have legitimate national security issues. The question is whether this improves it or makes it worse. Because what they will have is a battered, bruised, infuriated Iran with an erratic young leader that has to prove his toughness. They will still have nuclear materials unless Donald Trump decides to pull a rabbit out of the hat. We will not have a nuclear deal. So nothing much will have changed except for the following. First, they will have lost a significant amount of support from the American public because of this. And secondly, the rest of the Gulf isn't thrilled about this either. Sure, they don't like Iran. They have seen that Iran poses a threat to them, but they didn't really count on this either. They didn't count on being bombarded. People living in Dubai do not expect to have hotels blown up in their midst. And so they too are beginning to rethink how close do they really want to be with Israel? Maybe it doesn't pay to extend the Abraham Accords. Maybe their best bet is to really pull back, be a little independent here. And of course, there sits Russia, there sits China, all ready to make friends in the region. And if you're a Gulf state, why wouldn't you sign up with China? Why wouldn't you sign up with Russia? You don't trust the United States, you don't trust Iran, and you don't trust Israel. So from their selfish perspective, I don't see that this is helping Israel make friends in any sense. And of course, there will be a toll, financial and otherwise. Bibi is in a perpetual quest to rewrite history and to erase the stigma, the humiliation, the stain of October 7. And his salvation, he thinks, is in essentially destroying Iran. Problem, he won't destroy Iran, and he will have to continue to deal with this problem. The question is whether he's done enough, and the Iran hatred is so great in Israel that he will nevertheless survive elections, which are coming at some point this year. And it may be. I think the opposition in Israel has to rethink what they're doing by continually supporting him in these Iran ventures rather than taking a more skeptical view. They are giving him more legitimacy. They are losing any kind of leverage they might have with the electorate. And I think they have not played this well.
The sand is running through the glass, so we're getting near to the end. But a lot of people want to know about what, if the midterms go the Democrats' way, what they might be able to do. Can they invoke the 25th Amendment? What kind of authority can they do, perhaps overriding vetoes, although that seems less likely? Is there actual power, or is it just maybe just a grenade that's been dropped in their laps if they do win?
Well, the good news is what will stop. They will no longer spend more gobs of money on these ventures. There will not be more cuts to Medicaid. There will be not more bad things. And that's something when you're continuing to dig a hole. Secondly, there will be oversight. And these folks are absolutely loaded for bear. They want to get the facts. They want to figure out where the money is. They want to make the record. And when you ask them, what then does this lead to? They will tell you anything and everything is on the table, from impeaching people like Pam Bondi to pursuing civil and criminal action after they leave office. They want to make the record. And one of the reasons they try so hard not to go up there is at some level they know this. That's why Pam Bondi was doing damage control today, going behind closed doors, trying to get everyone to be nice to her out in public. They fear oversight. They know the facts are bad, and they fear leakers, and they fear whistleblowers who will have more access to members of Congress. It is also possible that if the win is big enough, some Republicans will look around and say, oh, holy smokes, maybe we better do something positive for the country. And maybe we actually ought to do something. For example, the housing bill. If you recall, Donald Trump says no one cares about housing. Well, this was a bipartisan positive thing for the country and for people who need housing. That's the sort of thing that might conceivably then get through. But it is the ability to hold some check on them. It is the ability to stop confirming judges, for goodness sakes, and stop confirming executive appointees. So at least the ranks will not be refilled or expanded with more and more crackpots.
Where do you put the prospects for the House and for the Senate then turning Democratic?
I do not want to jinx anything, folks, but I think it is highly, highly likely they will win the House. After all, they only have to pick up a few seats. And if you look at the ratings and you look at the races, the predictors and the rating charts look like they could pick up seats. And of course, in the midterms of a term, it is almost invariably so that the in power party loses. I have thought for a long time that the Senate is in play, and I still think so. I'm going to keep an eye on Maine, North Carolina, Ohio, Alaska, Texas, and here's a surprise, perhaps Iowa.
That's a long
And they
list.
don't have to win all of them. They only have to win 4 to get a majority.
Oh.
So I think the Democrats who were vulnerable, which would be in Michigan and Georgia, can probably breathe easier. John Ossoff is a magnificent candidate, has raised a ton of money. I think he will be fine. I think if either Haley Stevens or McMorrow win in the primary, Michigan will probably be fine. So it's a question of whether they can get to 4. And it depends how much worse things get. It depends if we're still in a war. It depends whether inflation continues to go up and jobs continue to go down. But it is possible. It is very possible.
Do you have a quick answer for the longer question of restoring democratic institutions, of undoing the Trump tentacles from not just the ridiculous projects like the Trump Arch, but the institutions that have been undermined, from the Smithsonian, to the Kennedy Center, to voting habits, and then the public perception along with it? This seems to be the most corrosive influence.
Absolutely. I have written on this, as you know, quite a bit, Pat, and that deserves an entire hour, if not a day
And
or a
let's
week.
put it on the books to do that.
We will. But there is lots to be done. It doesn't take a constitutional amendment. It may take breaking the filibuster, but there are lots of institutional guardrails that can be returned. There are lots of regulations that can be changed. The Supreme Court can be expanded legally. I believe that they can have term limits on the Supreme Court by statute rather than constitutional amendment. There are institutional changes that can be put in place. And I think one of the important things that we should look to is a reassertion, we've already seen it to a large extent, of state and local power. We have a federal system, and the degree to which we can insulate states, allow them to return to the job of being laboratories of democracy so that they can determine what they want in terms of police and what they want in terms of other policies. That is also an institutional protection. But there are lots of things, and you have to do everything from having an antitrust policy that actually works, so we do not have a stranglehold on the American economy, to regulation of the internet, to some real re-looking at campaign finance reform, which I think can be dealt with either with a different Supreme Court or even the existing one. So there is a long list, but I will say this, and maybe it's a good way to close us out.
We've got a few seconds left.
And in the spirit of David, something optimistic. Democracy is in our hands. It is not a foregone conclusion. We have agency. A week from Saturday, there's going to be another No Kings rally. Millions of people are going to pour into the streets. And we know when people get out there, they are much more likely to vote. If we stay engaged, if we give to causes we believe in, if we help candidates we believe in, if we volunteer, if we become active in our local communities, if we reach out to neighbors and friends who may be having second and third thoughts. Remember that lady at the gas station? I won't repeat what she called the president, but there are lots of people with buyer's remorse. Then, of course, we can return our democracy.
Okay.
So,
Jennifer Rubin, I know we're going to have you back. Happy anniversary. You started us, and here you are 6 years later joining us again. We're very happy you could and hope you'll do so again.
And thank you, Pat. You are always a delight.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody who was watching and listening today. You can also listen to this conversation online. Share the link with your friends.